going back years now, but I've noticed something about the video game format that, while being somewhat understandable, kind of works against the whole point of what a video game's realistically aiming to achieve. And those are games that, to me at least, appear to not really want to be games at all. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, to start with, let's go all the way back to one of the earliest video games to be released, with that being Pong. Being released to arcades in 1972, Pong was basically the first commercially successful video game to come out. Its concept was simple. It was a two-player experience where you and someone else took control of two white lines on the right and left. Flying across the box the lines are contained in is a small white cube, with the ultimate aim of the game being to make your white line collide with this cube, not only to keep it out the space that's behind your line, but to also make it ricochet in the other direction, requiring the second player to do the exact same thing. Basically, it's tennis. Every time you let the cube fly past you, the other player gains a point, and whoever gained 11 points first would win the game. A simple concept with simple gameplay and very simplistic controls. With everything being so basic, what was the actual appeal of this game though? I understand there weren't many video games around at this point, but the graphics are nothing incredible, there's no story, no amazing reward when beating the game, and upon looking at what a game like Pong lacks in comparison to games we see now, it gives an insight as to what the initial draw of video games were, and that was commonly a sense of competition, or the act of overcoming a challenge, and most importantly, interactivity. I'm a strong believer that when it comes to all the different media formats out there, while there's definitely some room for experimentation to see how they could merge together, they should realistically stay in their own lanes. If you go out to see a movie at the cinema, the expectation, unless the individual movie in question states otherwise, is that you'll be sitting down for a couple hours, watching and then leaving. Imagine you go into a film with those expectations, and after 10 minutes someone hands you a controller and says that to reach the next part of the film, you've got to progress to it yourself. That's not what people have signed up for. They've signed up to watch something, not to interact or play it. But as we know, from Pong, games have most definitely become far more elaborate, and this was a fairly gradual process that built up over time. For quite a while, but even despite huge developments being seen when it came down to the hardware that was being released, the vast majority of games were still quite binary experiences. Early examples of games that really started branching out were ones like Adventure for the Atari, a game where you took control of a cube, entering multiple different areas in this castle-like structure, and upon finding several keys, unlocking doors, and making your way through multiple weaving pathways, you can finally reach the credits, which indicate the end of the experience. Much like Pong, this is a game that from the moment it starts up, has you in control. At no point is that control taken away from you, and when paired up with the multiple new gameplay concepts, we start seeing the first real signs of how many games are going to structure their experiences, even decades on from Adventure. Unlike Pong, it's a single-player game, so the competition aspect is entirely absent. However, in place of that, you've got a whole different angle that's quite literally referred to in the game's title. It's an adventure game, one that doesn't lock you down to a set area with a set concept. It's one that brings the interactivity to another level by leaving things entirely in your hands. You start as a cube in a grey room, and only by using your own intuition and moving into the several different rooms that are here do we start understanding what our goal is. Much like many old games, there's a great deal of mystery to the experience, and that's something I feel lacks greatly in much of what we see now. I suppose that's what we can highlight as the first symptom of games now that don't really feel like they're working to the format's core strengths, and those are games that strip back the interactivity from the player by crushing their curiosity. As gaming's evolved, there's for some reason been a full-on shift to make almost every single game I play be perceived as approachable. And how do most games go about doing that? By flashing hundreds of tips up on screen that explain pretty much every single action, mechanic, and gameplay system possible. Now, there is a place for that. I'm not saying every single game should be like Adventure, where the game basically just tells you to get on with it. But apply that kind of mentality to a game like Adventure, and you diminish the experience to an unprecedented degree. There is a joy to getting lost and not knowing where to go, stumbling into a dragon and quickly realizing you're in danger. Despite only being a short game with very few areas, the time it can take to reach the end can vary greatly depending on how long it takes you to understand what's going on, where you need to go, and how to avoid the incoming threats you run into. You stick in a tip telling you which way to go or what to do with certain items, and you ruin the whole adventure part of the game. It's no longer really an adventure, it's a tour guide. You're not using your own instincts, you're following instructions. And while that still retains the interactive aspect, as I said, say, it does diminish it. It amazes me how I can find myself playing some of the most visually stunning games of all time, featuring in-depth gameplay systems, and such potential for players to get lost in the world, only to have that experience so often boil down to go here, do this, follow this marker, drop the item off here. Don't do that now, otherwise you'll fail. Again, the point I'm trying to make isn't that games shouldn't feature these things, it's more the fact that when they're relied on as a crutch, so certain gameplay scenarios play out as intended, the interactivity suffers as a result. And that's a huge factor in why games are such a long, convoluted and complex media format to work in. It's because of the interactivity, and oftentimes how players want to experiment and try absolutely anything they can in any given scenario. Say in a game like Red Dead 2, where you're told during a mission, don't shoot or don't draw the enemy's attention, the dream outcome in my opinion would be for that scenario to play out realistically in any possible way. You can still have the characters and even the game itself relay to the player that being quiet is the best option, but if the player doesn't want to do that, having the game adapt and react to their choice is ultimately what you want to see. The player made a choice and thus will deal with the consequence in-game. But it's never a surprise to me anymore that, not just in Red Dead 2, but so many games now, the game just puts the player straight into a fail state. They're given a game over screen before anything's played out. They're being told, you did that wrong, try again. But if a game's aim is to be all focused around interactivity, is there really such a thing as doing something wrong? It's like a petty argument you get into with a younger brother saying you're playing the game wrong. Am I? Or am I just playing it in my own way? Many games don't leave room for that anymore. They make you play by their rules. No matter if that means giving you a full-on game over if you defer from the set path, or if they coach you with those tips and tricks to make you understand early on what you should and shouldn't be doing. It has reached a point where it's a pick your poison kind of mentality. It just so happens that most games nowadays try to be as accommodating as humanly possible. They want to remove as many possibilities in their game that could lead to the player feeling exhausted, confused, or annoyed by their lack of understanding. To use another example, in the first Legend of Zelda, the secret bushes in that game the player had to burn have now become infamous due to the lack of any guidance whatsoever. They're a feature in my opinion that, in the scenario you don't have any sort of guide, will be outright tedious to find. There's quite literally no indication the bushes you can burn are any different. They look identical, you're given no real idea where the secret ones are, and what I'm highlighting here isn't that game design should follow this model instead. Not even close. It's just the exact other end of the spectrum from what I described. Whereas now, games put so much focus in having the player understand everything, back then it was all about setting them loose to find out for themselves. And whether it was intentional or not, I like that core principle a whole lot more, even if it did end up leading to things like the secret bushes. That's what I'm interested about though. Was that actually intentional? In reality, but all signs point towards that not being the case. Given what we see now, if a game like Adventure was made today, you'd have to imagine it would feature things like objective markers and tips. But on the other hand, I won't write off the possibility that with the changing times and new developers that have come and gone throughout the years, maybe this shift was more cultural compared to practical. Maybe the developers of these older games had a different outlook of what a video game should be, and what a player actually wanted from them. Because while I'd say nowadays, I'd argue the majority don't mind, and might actually enjoy the level of handholding games employ, I tend to find those who are deeply invested in games and analyse them deeply, find there's certain characteristics now that if stripped out, would ultimately result in a better experience, even despite other players now being met with a greater sense of confusion. So that's phase 1, guidance. Whereas games of the past so often just chucked you in the deep end and made you figure out stuff on your own, now many games hold your hand to such an extent they don't just guide you from point to point, they also fail you when refusing to stay in line with this guidance. Phase 2 is perhaps even bigger though, and that's the grand expansion of video gaming as a whole. We've given a few examples of what early video games resembled, going from competitive sports emulations to single-player adventure games. But there's a whole category I missed which were by far the most popular games around, and those are the arcade titles. These come in many different forms, and lie somewhere in between the intense restrictiveness of a game like Pong, while also not being as open-ended as games like Adventure or Zelda. We're talking about games like Mario, Sonic, Streets of Rage, Mortal Kombat. These are games that really start merging everything we talked about, creating a natural progression where outside influences start playing a more significant factor. If you wonder why franchises like Mario have stuck around for so long, it's because of several key things. You've obviously got external factors like the iconography of the characters and world, the classic Mario theme, but in gameplay terms, they started off simple and gradually expanded while retaining that easy to understand nature. In the very first Super Mario Bros, everything's just laid out so clearly in every possible regard. The controls were simple, featuring 4 directions options to move in, as well as a jump and run button. The enemies, while being rather limited, all featured unique designs and standout characteristics from each other. And while the very first stage may have thrown players off at the time, the idea you need to move left to right, dodging out the way of all the obstacles in between to eventually reach the end, it's one that of course is not only easy to get to grips with, but was also repeated in so many other games we saw from that point on. What else did Mario and all these other games introduce? A narrative to follow, whether it be saving the princess, stopping Dr. Eggman, or taking down a whole group of unique villains. Games gradually started leaning more towards this storytelling aspect, and I have to assume it's a choice that was not only born out of influence, with many of these developers most definitely looking at elements of film and TV for certain ideas and concepts, but it also must have had a great deal to do with motivating the player in general. It's an important point to bring up. No matter if you create a brilliant gameplay system, the fact is, players want to feel like they're progressing towards something. That in itself can come in multiple different forms, but as I say, the one that I think got expanded on to a massive degree were the narrative elements, presenting a journey from start to finish that keeps the player engaged. And that's ultimately what Phase 2 in its entirety is for me, a lack of focus on what makes a video game a video game. Notice how the narratives I referred to, while now being present, were incredibly simple. I feel there was an overall greater motivation towards fleshing out the world, as opposed to a concrete storyline. So while you're being introduced to the world of Mario, with all its green pipes, Goombas, and our arch nemesis Bowser, the actual story's still a case of go save the princess. Same goes for something like Zelda. Despite featuring a world that you could argue was even more expansive and fleshed out compared to Mario, the motivation was the exact same: go save the princess. Now this is where we can fast forward quite a bit to consoles like the PS1 and 2, as by this time, games were now getting far more complex. Due to numerous evolutions in every department and genre, you couldn't expect to release another game emulating Mario and thinking it'll do well. You could argue with many games you saw on consoles like the NES, Mega Drive and SNES, that period had already come and gone. Players now wanted something different, and they wanted more. And especially in the PS1 era, we saw a very hard shift away from the more arcadey experiences of the past to this new direction of in-depth, story-driven experiences. Notable examples would be games like Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Final Fantasy VII, and of course, Metal Gear Solid. Now, while there were still plenty of games in previous generations that were starting to experiment with the idea of full-on story-driven experiences, I'd say it was around this point where the magnitude of these narratives and the number of story-driven games that were being made really started to skyrocket. Again, not only were the biggest titles in previous generations more arcadey experiences, but much of what surrounded them were as well. And while you can definitely still feel that with the PS1, with there being plenty of games that focus purely on a simple concept and raw gameplay, it's games like the ones I've listed that would go on to lead the way to what most games nowadays ultimately focus on. Silent Hill featuring elements to its narrative that are most definitely inspired by the bizarre abstract work of filmmakers like David Lynch. Resident Evil going more down the route of your classic Hollywood horror film, featuring a plot that's initially simple in its concept, before revealing a whole bunch of details based around betrayal and conspiracy that makes things a bit deeper. However, the one that has to be highlighted most prominently is obviously Metal Gear Solid, having a fantastic layered plot that introduced a cinematic edge to the video game scene that really hadn't been seen up to that point. And I mean that in all aspects. The plot itself wasn't purely goofy and contained to solely fictional events. Hideo Kojima, the game's director, made a concerted effort to incorporate real-world elements into much of the story beats. As many filmmakers had already done for years, Kojima used the gaming format not merely as a way to make some temporary dumb fun, something you let your kids play on to keep them distracted for a few hours, but I'd say Metal Gear Solid was a pretty significant turning point that would have changed a lot of people's minds and opened them up to what a video game could actually offer someone. As I say, we're talking about a game that deals with undercover government operations, the effects of nuclear weapons, the military-industrial complex, and these aren't things that are just being thrown about for the hell of it. Kojima clearly had a point to make, and he was one of the very first to clearly channel that point into this new art form. Metal Gear Solid at no point gives off the feeling of cheap thrills. The gameplay's slow and measured, the story touches on subjects that aren't purely fictional and goofy, and the overall style of the game is pretty dark and moody, not something your average kid is going to be fixated on compared to other games with poppy colours. However, but ever since this game's release, there's been a massive knock-on effect that on one hand proved how influential Kojima was with this first game, but on the other ties straight into another glaring negative where games are no longer games. And that comes down to one of my biggest issues with games nowadays, and that's the amount of cutscenes we now see and the extreme length of them. As I already mentioned, the element that was praised immensely at the time, and has since gone on to be one of the most influential qualities of Metal Gear, is the cinematic elements. Cutscenes were now being used not just to bring a player from point A to point B, or to more easily convey a certain narrative beat. These were cutscenes that were being constructed to appear like you're watching some kind of espionage flick at the movies. And given the many influences you can blatantly see in Metal Gear, with one of the most obvious being Kojima's love of the character James Bond, you can see where this was stemming from. Kojima's always been a film fanatic. Even now, he continues posting on his social media about what film he's currently watching and what he thought of it. But for all the qualities I admire about merging these cinematic features into a video game, we're at another phase where the inherent purpose of a video game is being reduced yet again. And while this could start being seen in many games from the PS1 onwards, we only have to really look at Metal Gear in itself to get a general perception of how intense these cutscenes would eventually get. Because believe me, while Metal Gear finds itself getting dragged for how long its cutscenes get, there are plenty other games that feature cutscenes that are equally long, while not having anywhere near the same quality as Metal Gear. MGS1 to MGS2 saw a massive step up. Cutscenes got longer, but they also got even more deep and interesting. MGS3 saw Kojima take somewhat of a step back. You still get a lot of cutscenes, but nowhere near as much as MGS2, with most also not being anywhere near as long. MGS4, however, was Kojima's cutscene magnum opus. It's a game that's notorious for having several cutscenes that go on for so long, your controller will turn itself off automatically. And while that's pretty hilarious, I see that as a genuine symbol of where things ultimately go too far in this department. A video game, first and foremost, should be about interaction. It should be about what the player's able to achieve via their own inputs and actions, not watching all those play out on their own. Yeah, the cutscenes in this game can be very impressive, and the information we learn can be quite interesting, but the cost is way too big in my opinion. And it's situations like this where you've got to take a step back and remove yourself from your own enjoyment of these games and observe them more from an outside perspective. Not just from the view of someone who's not a big fan of Metal Gear in particular, but someone who's not that familiar with video games at all. I've said many times that I enjoy the long cutscenes of Metal Gear because I'm actively invested in the story, the world, and the characters. But that does not mean I'm justified in saying others should feel the same way. In fact, I feel the opposite. If I heard someone criticizing MGS4 as being a poor game because of how long the cutscenes are, I would actually have to agree. There's things I really enjoy about MGS4 and its gameplay. It literally used to be my favorite game of all time. But the fact is, as a video game experience, it's not very good. Much of the game doesn't work at all to the strengths of what people search for in a video game, and the most significant of those would ultimately have to be the cutscenes. They're just too long. There's no two ways about it. Even as someone who looks at these games as some of the best ever made, I'm also not blind to the fact that I and many others are playing video games because of what we contribute to the experience. As I say, if I wanted to watch an animated movie, I'd stick on Netflix. But that's the grander point I'm getting to. Despite everything I've said, I think there is a place for an MGS4 in the gaming scene. Something you'd look at more as an experiment to see how far someone could go in the cinematic direction. And in those terms, I've got no problem with it. It still doesn't mean it's great when looking in a video game context, but more of a unique gem that'd be interesting to experience. My issue is that it seems games from that point on, yet again, follow Kojima's lead, diving headfirst in this cinematic direction and stripping away more and more of what people once identified as a video game. And I suppose for me at least, this has led to a feeling of fatigue. It's less about the quality or depth of these cutscenes now, it's more the fact that I'm now constantly expecting to wait minutes on end so I can get back to playing. And it's left me in a position where I'm now constantly left scratching my head as to what I'm actually doing. I press play on a game to play it, but especially in the larger titles that come out now, there's so much focus put on the story that the gameplay itself can almost seem secondary. I remember really enjoying the gameplay of The Last of Us Part 2, but that's not what stands out when thinking about that game. Instead, what stands out to me most are once again the very drawn out cutscenes that took me out of the gameplay to experience the narrative. And in saying that, it makes us wonder, is there an in-between? Is the reason these developers are relying so heavily on cutscenes to convey their story because they don't have any other way? And the answer to that is obviously no, with some of the best examples of this coming from games like Half-Life and Portal, both being developed by Valve. These are games that from start to finish have you in control. We don't get any cutscenes that interrupt the gameplay, and even despite that, these games still found a way to create a world and narrative that remain pertinent, interesting, and are talked about to this day. My ultimate point about this phase, that being phase 3, isn't to say all games should be like how Valve do them, because then video gaming would be homogenous, but they're the closest example I can think of to what I describe as a perfect game experience. Portal itself, I've gone on record as saying, is one of the very few games games I perceive as being perfect, with that being for a multitude of reasons. But one of them is most definitely the way they handle the balance of story and gameplay. There's such a level of intrigue and mystery that's created from elements like the environment we're placed in, and characters like GLaDOS that interact with us. But at no point are you made to simply sit back and watch any of this play out on its own. It's a balance that I think typifies what I'm personally searching for in a video game, something that's always requiring my input, while simultaneously presenting something deeper to give the experience more depth and weight. So cutscenes overall, they have their purpose. I think they were a far more useful tool in the early days of gaming compared to now. Just look back to the first Silent Hill game, for example, compared to the incredibly pixelated characters in-game with all their awkward, herky-jerky movements. The cutscenes allowed us to actually see these characters and the world in far greater detail. It was the technology itself that encouraged this kind of approach, and as a result, this led to the excellent cutscenes we get in that game that remain short, to the point, and oftentimes leave the player with a very unusual feeling. The shortness of them, once again, would be based around time and resource management. For a PS1 game, the FMVs do look pretty fantastic, so I have to imagine it would have taken quite a while to complete even some of the shorter sequences we see. And on top of that, I find these add even more to the off-kilter atmosphere of the game, with many of the moments we see fitting in that bizarre, uncanny valley area that's actually quite hard to convey nowadays, given how photorealistic games now look. Moving on to Phase 4. This is something that I think at one point was incredibly prominent in the video game scene, but in recent times has started to fade more into the background, and that would be QuickTime events. These have always seemed like a purposeful in-between for gameplay and cutscenes, with QTEs being employed to keep the experience engaging, while also maintaining the more tightly structured events we see during a cutscene. So whereas in normal gameplay, pressing the X button might simply make you jump, during a QuickTime event, pressing X at the right time might now launch your character into a whole number of actions you can't regularly perform. And while you can understand the thought process behind these, I think there's a good reason why these have gradually started getting phased out over the years, because ultimately, by combining light gameplay elements with a cutscene, you're not getting the best out of either, which seem to always result in QTEs being more annoying compared to anything else. In a game like MGS2, for example, the player's made to realise early on that when it comes to the cutscenes, it's okay to put down your controller for a while because of how long they can oftentimes be. Now imagine that, but all of a sudden when Snake gets into a fight with someone, you get a button prompt flashing up saying hit X. You first got the cutscene itself being taken away from, drawing the player out the scene by having this external arcadey button prompt showing up. You've got the surprise of the event itself, which will have certain players scrambling for their controllers in the event they put them down. And if you fail, you've then got the annoyance that comes in having to watch the cutscene again and retry the event. Now in saying that, not all QTEs play out exactly the same. Many of them do play out like how I describe, but you also have more recent examples like Insomniac's Spider-Man games, that while featuring QTEs, don't require you to actually complete them to progress, with these also being able to be entirely switched off as well. It's more the type of ones we see in games like Resi 4 and 5, situations that demand you press a button quickly, or make you spam a certain button numerous times until you progress. These have just never been satisfying in my view. I understand the want to merge the gameplay with these more cinematic moments, but it very rarely works for me. Funny enough, one of the few examples I can give where a QTE was effective is in MGS4 with the microwave scene. This scene proves that under very specific circumstances, the act of spamming a button, for example, can work effectively to enhance an entire sequence. The button spamming quite literally makes the microwave scene. It would still be powerful without it, no doubt, but nowhere near the level of actually making the player feel the struggle that Snake's going through. That is a massive exception though, and in highlighting that, it only goes to show even more how unnecessary QTEs are in the vast majority of instances. You've still got a reduced amount of control, with the additional surprise and failure element that normal cutscenes don't bother you with. But finally, we reach Phase 5, optional dialogue, and sometimes even dialogue in general. And in certain instances, this is something I'd argue has become one of my least favourite features that I know is cropping up in so many games nowadays. This covers a slightly broader scope, however. So beginning with the optional dialogue, in some ways, due to the optional nature of it, you might be wondering how this fits in with the whole angle I'm coming from. If I've got a problem with games that essentially strip more control away from the player, surely having something optional that you can choose to engage or not to engage with fits perfectly in what I'm looking for, and in theory, that would be correct. My issue in this case is less about the concept and more about the execution. Yes, I agree, but optional dialogue can be a great way to get more out of the characters you interact with, and depending on their dialogue, it can deepen their personalities and flesh out the overall world. I've simply seen one too many examples in recent times though, where we end up suffering the exact same fate as those cutscenes that go on for too long. The most recent example that immediately comes to mind is Horizon Forbidden West. Having always been quite interested in the first game, I remember really looking forward to Forbidden West when picking it up for the first time. The graphics looked amazing, the gameplay seemed pretty good, and I'm telling you this to reinforce the fact I wanted to enjoy this game. But oh my god, this game very quickly became somewhat of a nightmare for me, and that's because for a large portion of the time I gave it, it seemed to be combining almost all the phases I've now listed into one package. Cutscenes that are incredibly long, a lack of interactivity in many moments, but the breaking point for me really was the dialogue we see between the many characters we talk with. Forbidden West might very well have some of the most boring dialogue I've ever experienced in a video game. The optional dialogue options are plentiful, but even when simply trying to progress conversations quickly, all the dialogue here was just so long and dry that my mind very soon switched off. I came into the game wanting to learn more about the world of Horizon, but due to the way the information's relayed to the player, I very soon lost interest. A lot of games suffer in that department now, in my opinion. There's too many occasions now where I start a game really wanting to get into it, but end up disappointed due to aspects like the world building being tackled by some long-winded bit of exposition. You can't win either way. You either miss out on this world building and end up confused at what's happening around you, or you engage with it and end up bored as a result. Forbidden West is an example of dialogue that I just think is dreadful. It goes on too long and doesn't grip me to any degree. However, going back to that same way of thinking I have with Metal Gear, there's also games I really admire that still aren't far off what I dislike about games like Forbidden West. The clearest example of that for me is the game Disco Elysium. There are so many aspects of this game that I think are excellent. I love the soundtrack, I love the art style, and unlike Horizon, I think the vast majority of the dialogue here is incredibly well written, with a genuine message and purpose behind much of what we see. The overall problem I bring up is still here though. While featuring many choices and ways of going about tons of situations in the game, which is great, Disco Elysium's another game where you're being made to sit back and take in row after row of dialogue. And even comparing this to games that go heavy in the cutscene department, this might actually be an even more uninteresting approach. We've already talked about games that rely on their cinematic elements, questioning their ultimate purpose in the gaming format, and if they'd genuinely be better off pursuing some kind of animated series or film instead. But Disco Elysium more often than not ends up getting compared to a book, which I have to assume comes back to the way much of the dialogue's written. But alongside that, I see it more as a book purely because there's much less consistent engagement in regards to the visuals and gameplay. It's very common in this game to have interactions last upwards of 10 minutes, where in between that time, what you're mainly seeing is the characters in the background standing around, maybe with the odd unique interaction. Outside that, you've got walls and walls of text that present themselves and are read out to you with each option you pick. Much like I said about MGS4, I do think there's a place for this kind of game, and while the interaction we have with this game is obviously nowhere near the level of something like Half-Life, that is lessened quite a bit when taking into account the choices we make actually matter and create a noticeable difference in how you progress. But just look at the evolution from where we started to where we are now. While quite a bit of what I brought up here does have negative connotations surrounding them, having games branch out in all these different ways is actually a big positive. Could you imagine if all games merely followed on from the early beat-em-ups and platformers of the past? Gaming would be long dead by now if you didn't have this kind of variety. So what's the actual distinction I'm making? What do I perceive as being a positive or negative for gaming as a whole? Well, I suppose it's all about intention realistically, for me at least, but it all ties back to the importance of control and interaction, as those two components are what I perceive as arguably the most essential parts of a game. If you've got a point and click game like Disco Elysium or Broken Sword, you already know the level of control is going to be limited to a certain degree. You're not allowed to go around punching things, trying to steal cars or anything. They're just not that type of game. But in the routes they do follow, they make sure to keep the interaction a vital part of the experience, whether it be the many different outcomes to choose from in Disco Elysium or the many puzzle solving moments in Broken Sword. Broadening our view outside merely point and click games though, I think we're now at an interesting point where developers are grappling with what players want versus what they can actually achieve. Because realistically, the tech's so advanced now, pretty much anything can be achieved at this point. And a symptom of that, as you may have noticed, is that open world games now rule. We've talked quite a bit about Kojima in this video, but he's another great example to look at when it comes to what game companies end up pursuing nowadays. Whereas everything he made prior to MGS5 was linear, up upon stepping into open world design with MGS5, he's yet to go back. And it's a vital point to touch on to understand what it is players are searching for, and why there's almost an expectation with big games now there's going to be some kind of open world element. It's all about freedom, and that's what I think's at the very heart of video gaming as a whole. When I bring up lack of interactivity and being locked into cutscenes, these are things that take freedom away from the player, because they're not being given control. But as I've just mentioned, I think that's the most important factor players appreciate about video games, regardless of what type of game they're playing. Think about Telltale games like The Walking Dead, for example, a series that I'm actually quite a big fan of. I don't imagine there's many players who, after playing for the first 30 minutes or so, will be wondering why they can't go where they want and explore the world on a grander scale. It's just not that kind of game, and that's perfectly fine. Just because I say freedom is the apex of a game experience doesn't mean every single one has to provide it in the most overt way. As I say, that freedom could be seen as having many choices and outcomes, as opposed to the freedom of exploring an open world. That being said, I think there's a very good reason why GTA 6 has been the most talked about game going for quite literally over a decade, because in my view, that series has always been the apex of what people want out of games, featuring open worlds that resemble our own, a ginormous amount of interactions we can experience both in and outside missions, and allowing the player to engage with all these things at their own pace. For as much as I like to be objective, this is where we do reach a point where subjectivity can play a major factor regarding everything I've now laid out. We've highlighted how freedom can be shown off in different ways depending on what style of game someone's making. For as much as some will enjoy wandering the fields of Red Dead 2, others don't find that kind of freedom interesting. They prefer to have it reflected in a more structured experience, and that's perfectly fine too. But where I can be a bit more objective is when it comes to the effectiveness and how all these elements are handled. The only reason the freedom we see in Rockstar games works is because of how detailed their worlds actually are. You could have games that allow you to explore a completely barren wasteland, and while you could say it's giving the player freedom, that's pointless if there's nothing else to experience. When looking at what games are being released now and what they're offering players, while there have been some in recent memory that have been praised to no end about the freedom of gameplay, the most notable example of course being Baldur's Gate 3, I also find there's many surrounding games like that which, despite clearly having big budgets and tons of work being put into them, almost fundamentally misunderstand what it is people are searching for in a game. The kind of games that offer you boring exposition via dialogue trees, compared to having you discover that information in a more creative manner. The kind to lock you into a cutscene during a set piece, compared to letting you experience it yourself. As gaming's progressed, and developing these larger titles become so much more advanced and costly, I can understand where some corners are getting cut in pursuit of a grander goal. But I still feel there's a case to say that many of these should perhaps reevaluate their priorities somewhat, and return to what the vast majority of gamers actually appreciate about the format. That's not me saying everything should go back to the days of Pong and Mario, obviously, but I hope in looking at those past titles, you've seen there is something to be garnered from the simplicity of those times. Tastes change and formats progress. I do understand that, but in taking control away from the player more and more, whether it's done overtly or simply not giving them as much to work with, I start getting confused as to what the ultimate point of making a game would be. Is the reason we're locked down to 15-minute cutscenes a sign of being unable to convey these details in a gameplay context? And if so, why is that? And does it have a place in a game to begin with? In some cases, I speculate it might be more a case of vanity, not just from directors like Kojima, although I'd say he definitely falls in this category at points, but also the many other gaming auteurs that have spawned since Kojima essentially birthed the idea, giving off a strong feeling that by pursuing this cinematic approach more heavily, it gives them more credibility in some sort of way, harking back to the unfounded arguments of games not being a format worth taking seriously. But overall, I think what I'm personally searching for in a game nowadays is something that continues to offer new aspects when you delve deeper into the experience, no matter if that comes in the form of the more binary choice-based options we talked about, or maybe in the form of less linear discoveries you have to search for on your own. Games to me are all about that feeling of freedom and discovery, with that getting applied to every single game I play. It could be an interesting plot development, a new combo move you figure out. Games have so many layers that you're never going to pin down one encompassing idea and say, this is what a video game should be defined as. But in highlighting all the elements I have, I hope I've given a slightly greater deal of clarity on what games started as, how they evolved, and why I feel there's certain games that are perhaps stepping over a line in my opinion, to where I'm left slightly unsatisfied by a game, and questioning why the format was chosen to begin with. If I wanted to read a book, I'd read a book. You get the point. If you're choosing to create a game, I think those well-known gaming conventions should be shining through in at least some areas, and not being covered up by concepts I can experience just as well, and even better in other media formats.